This is going to be just an introduction, kind of an overview of some of the central ideas. Lots of the other sessions over the coming week are going to dig a lot deeper into a number of things that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to be framing social ecology as at once an ecological philosophy, as a sweeping social critique of hierarchical society, and as a revolutionary political theory. Social ecology was mostly developed in the mid-20th century as a response to the emerging ecological crisis, to the failure of Marxism-Leninism to emancipate humanity and create a stateless society, and to the global social ferment and upheaval of the 1960s. Social ecology is also an intensely interdisciplinary body of thought, drawing most heavily on ecology and evolutionary biology, on anthropology, urban studies, feminist theory, radical political theory, and, as we'll talk about more tomorrow, dialectical philosophy. And over the course of this week, a lot of other speakers are going to be unpacking more thoroughly our analysis of white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism, our philosophy of nature, our visions of a free and ecological society, and perhaps most crucially, our strategies for revolution. And I'll be touching on each of these things, but more surface level. So just to give a quick roadmap, I'm going to be diving into what I see as the three foundational ideas of social ecology. And those are that humanity is a part of nature. It's number one. Number two, that the ecological crisis is a social crisis, that human destruction of nature is a consequence of the particular social relations of hierarchy and domination structuring our society, rather than something innate or inherent to human beings. And then lastly, the possibility and the necessity of a social revolution to transform those social relations, to create a new society organized along directly democratic and communistic lines. And that's kind of the core political vision of social ecology. But I just want to start with the question of nature and how we conceive of it. So I just want to throw back to you all. What does the word nature mean to you? Or what do you associate with it? Somebody, anybody? Ecosystems, okay. What else? Roberto? Every living thing? Cycles of life and death? Anything else? Literally everything. That's why it's a hard word, right? Because we're often meaning something very specific or particular when we use it, but also meaning literally everything. In Western European derived society, we are often, our cultural framework for understanding nature is that it is everything except for us. All the things that are out there that are not human beings, or not human creations. I think many of you will be familiar with a guy named Bill McKibben, who's a major figure in the U.S. climate movement, and was the founder of 350.org. He's written a lot of really interesting books on environmental and climate questions. One of his early books from the late 80s is called The End of Nature. And in this book, he points to how the atmospheric chemistry, the changes that we have made to our planet's atmospheric chemistry through human industrial activities have impacted every corner of the earth, have affected in one way or another every single living thing on the planet. And so his conclusion in this book is that nature, as we understand it, has effectively ceased to exist. That everything that was once wild, untouched nature now bears human fingerprints. And that's kind of the backdrop of a lot of our cultural assumptions or frameworks for how we make sense of the word nature and how we relate to the rest of the non-human world. But I think if we interrogate this concept of nature as being defined to the exclusion of human beings, it becomes quite apparently untenable, even sort of silly. The entirety of our planet's ecology is the totality of all interactions between every living thing on this earth and our planet's geochemistry. It's something that human beings are thoroughly intertwined with. We are obviously products of natural evolution, the evolutionary process of life's expansion over natural history. If we try to separate out human beings from those processes, we're left with kind of a vision of humanity as these sort of supernatural creatures who are in some way not dependent upon or interacting with the rest of the web of life. I also I think one way to help think about this, or that kind of like demonstrates how silly this way of thinking about our relationship to the more than human world, is if we redefine the word nature to mean everything that exists except for ants. And I think if you did that, you would also find yourself at an end of nature, because ants engineer and influence just about every ecosystem on Earth. Every single living thing has impacts on its environment, that it affects other living things around it, because that's the very nature of ecology as a living system. As a product of interactions between different things. And so I just wanted to make the case that if we're thinking about these questions of human relationship to nature in ecological terms, the question we shouldn't be asking is if we will have an effect on our ecologies, but what effect will be having. And it's social ecology's contention that humanity is actually capable of having a positive role to play in our ecologies and in the process of natural evolution. I also want to note that this vision of nature as something that does not include human beings is a culturally specific one. And this is something that Haya and Abundia are going to dig into more thoroughly in their talk, but I just think it's important to note that this is not a conception of nature shared by most of the world's indigenous peoples, most of whose lifeways are thoroughly intertwined with their local ecology, which they influence and shape and steward in a variety of ways. And instead, I think we need to understand that this vision of nature is one that is downstream of the particular kind of society that we have, namely one that is organized according to the principles of domination, hierarchy, and control. And at the same time as social ideologies of domination separate us out from the natural world, we also project those ideas about the naturalness of hierarchy and domination back onto the natural world, sometimes in very obviously silly ways. For example, people often refer to the lion as the king of beasts, or the king of the jungle, or we will refer to the ant that performs the reproductive function in her colony as the queen. Obviously, neither of these animals are embedded in anything resembling a command and control relationship with other animals. They're playing a specific ecological function, but we look at them through the lens of our society of domination and control. So if nature isn't all the stuff out there, trees and rocks and whatnot, that aren't human beings, how instead do social ecologists conceive of nature? And the way we use the word nature is to refer to the developmental unfolding of natural history, of the process of life's evolutionary expansion over the past 3.5 billion years. And even though it's impossible to predict the particular evolutionary pathway of any given branch of the tree of life, we also think that one can draw out some broad tendencies of nature across geological and evolutionary time that emerge out of the underlying mechanics of biological evolution and of ecological interaction. And those are really important for thinking about our place in this trajectory across time, and the role that we might play in the future. So the three that I'm going to point to are the tendencies toward diversification, interdependence, and maybe a little more controversially, towards freedom. And so for diversification, Darwinian natural selection at its most basic level is a theory of diversity, the sources of the ever-expanding new forms of life through what ultimately are fairly basic underlying mechanisms. And the diversification of life and of nature is, one of its most obvious, stunning features if you look at it over geologic and evolutionary time. Even after cataclysmic extinction events, in which upwards of 90% of all species on Earth are eliminated by some kind of disaster, we see again and again life radiates outward into new forms, and this is driven by kind of this interplay between the adaptiveness of living things, but also their voraciousness of nature's unwillingness to leave any stone unturned, any living form that can work will. And if you think about these really marginal environments that don't really make sense as the place to set up shop if you're a given organism, nevertheless find themselves exploited, from methane seeps at the bottom of the ocean to lichen on the tops of mountains colonizing bare rock. Life is finding a way, but most importantly, life is finding many, many different ways, every possible way. And so I point to this underlying drive towards increasing levels of diversification as a really crucial tendency. The second one is life's tendency towards interdependence. And living things are not existing in a world of rocks and water and atmosphere and stuff. They're living in a world created by one another. Because all living things are co-creating the conditions of existence for other living things. You think about the lichen example. This is a pioneer species. They're breaking down rock and converting it into their bodies, which then creates soil that becomes the conditions for life for plants, which become the conditions for life for small animals, and on and on. And this is not an upward chain of being, but a web of mutual interdependence that circles back on itself. And that's really a product of that voraciousness that I was talking about before. And this shapes how evolution happens as well, where living things co-evolve symbiotic relationships together that intertwine all living things together across historical time. Such that there's basically no form of life on this planet that can survive except in relation to other living things. And this creates, throughout the whole system, kind of systemic mutuality, where all life is interwoven to itself. And I think this understanding of the interdependent nature of ecology and of evolutionary history forces us to rethink that projection of human social relations onto nature. Predators, even if we imagine them in a food chain or some hierarchy of being from top to bottom, are not actually in charge of their prey. They're not in command and control relationships. They are mutually dependent on one another for their survival. And so the more provocative version of this that Dan puts out there is that hierarchy is a social thing, social creation of human beings, but it's not a characteristic of nature itself. I think we might push back on that in some ways, but I think this understanding of interdependence forces us to kind of rethink how our frame of reference in a society of rulers and ruled distorts our understanding of the natural world. And this interdependence acts back upon diversification. So it unlocks new ways of being, creating new ecological niches in the spaces between. So these interact to make the possibilities for life's diversification far, far greater. And then lastly, I just want to talk about nature's tendency towards expanding levels of freedom. And I use that word in a deliberate provocation. I think in its place we could also refer to things like, or use terms like self-directivity or subjectivity or consciousness. But we're basically talking about the capacity for organisms to direct their own existence and to, over evolutionary time, shape their own evolutionary destinies. And so, in all living things, ourselves down to single-celled organisms, a lot of what's going on are automatic processes. They're attuned to predictable environment, doesn't really entail anything resembling decision-making. But even the simplest organisms on Earth, single-celled life, has a foundation for this self-directivity. And that's that they take in sensory information about their world and can have variable responses to it. But I think, in evolutionary history, the possibilities for life's freedom become dramatically more expansive with the emergence of multicellularity, plants, fungi, and animals. Really only in the past 10 years or so are we getting any understanding of the extent of self-directivity in plant life, their ability to respond to stimuli, to communicate with each other, to learn from past experiences and do things differently based on them. This is very new science, but I think we need to not think of these kind of capacities as uniquely animal. For fungi, I suspect we will never fully comprehend the extent to which self-directivity takes place in that kingdom, mostly because almost everything they're doing is invisible to us underground on a microscopic scale. But the inklings that we have suggest it's pretty expansive. And then obviously we are animals, and so our grasp of freedom in animal life is much more obvious and intuitive to us. But I think it's worth reflecting on or thinking through how that developed in evolutionary time. The most crucial period in the evolution of animals was about 500 million years ago, a period that we call the Cambrian explosion. And this is the time period where basically all modern phyla of animals emerged. It was also the period where complex sensory equipment like eyes, nervous systems, defensive traits like shells and armored bodies, offensive traits like claws and tentacles all emerged. And this is because there became a newly complex environment that created new selective pressures requiring variable responses to a more complicated world. For the first time, animals were not just reacting to floating nutrients in the water or pH or these other kinds of like passive sensory information, but the variable and mobile movements of other animals. So this is an evolutionary arms race where we now need to understand each other in this super dynamic environment. And so this is the evolutionary history of the animal mind, the ability to think, make decisions, development of brains and other forms of nervous systems. And so in a lot of ways, freedom, the ability to be self-directed, is something that comes out of the complexity that's created by these other tendencies of nature towards these ever more complex environments that require us to respond in a variable way. Obviously these capacities have developed dramatically over the course of the last 500 million years. The things that, the minds of animals that exist now among us in this room, and any number of other species are much more developed than the crab things or whatever that were alive in the ocean 400 million years ago. But that was kind of a turning point in this whole development. And this capacity for self-directivity, for freedom, itself acts back upon diversification and interdependence, because it means that individuality can shape the evolutionary path of animals. It means that innovations made by thinking beings can unlock new mutualities, mutualisms that not previously existed. And so this is the developmental process that human beings emerged out of. And I think we embody these three tendencies in a number of really crucial ways. The framework that we use in social ecology to make sense of this relationship of humanity to nature as a whole, to these broad processes of historical development, is what we call first nature and second nature. First nature is that this whole developmental process of biological evolution that I've been describing, with these underlying tendencies toward diversification and interdependence and freedom. Second nature is a new developmental historical process that emerges out of that is a product of our evolved sociality, intelligence, and care for one another. So it's nested within, but not reducible to first nature. We couldn't explain it by recourse to understanding Darwinian natural selection or anything else alone. To define second nature most simply, we could call this culture or society, those clusters of entirely malleable features of human society that are not biologically determined, but shape our existence in lots of ways. Ultimately, the changeability of human culture and society is one of our most defining characteristics, our ability to relate to one another in a near endless variety of ways. And of course, this need to understand the full range of human possibilities of social forms is why there's so many anthropologists around the ISC. You'll be hearing from a couple of them over the course of this week. And it's just kind of really fundamental to thinking through our place in natural history. We're not like ants, where the relations between, say, worker ants and queen ants or soldier ants are biologically determined. These are social forms that we can change. And so that brings me to the second kind of core principle or idea of social ecology, the centrality of the changeability of our social forms and social relations to the environmental crisis, to the ecological crisis, and to creating a free society. And it's because our relationship to nature is entirely structured through and by those social forms of second nature. And even among very quite radical or socially conscious environmentalists, it's still quite common to hear people refer to these catastrophic changes happening to our world as if they are caused by humans with no elaboration, as if humanity is some kind of unproblematic whole. And obviously changes like climate change and other features of the ecological crisis are caused by human industrial activities. But that surface level assessment doesn't tell us anything about why we're doing these things, despite the best interests of humanity as a whole. And this framing of humanity is as a collectivity is responsible for the ecological crisis amounts to a flattening of humanity. It's this undifferentiated mass. We are some kind of horde of locusts collectively devouring the world. And I think this framing of humanity as an unproblematic and undifferentiated whole is both dangerous and self-defeating. And it's an extension of this idea we talked about before of seeing human beings as separate from nature. And so if you kind of approach these problems with the perspective that we are something that is not nature, and we have an inherently destructive relationship to the stuff that is nature, all you're left with is, and if you want to defend nature, you kind of necessarily have a relationship of opposition or hatred for human beings. Leaves us with a hollow misanthropy and no real pathways to positive change, and except possibly killing all of us off or removing human beings from particular cherished ecosystems. And that very way of thinking that human beings are a threat to nature, we must remove them to protect it, is what has characterized various practices of ecological colonialism, where racist governments remove indigenous peoples from different ecosystems in the name of conservation. That's the story of the national park system in this country, of a variety of wildlife refuges in Africa, and of course removing indigenous peoples to protect ecosystems has primarily been to the detriment of both. But I think most importantly, this way of thinking is a misdiagnosis of the crisis, for the simple fact that we are not all actually deciding human society's relationship to the natural world. In the United States, we have all manner of social inequalities that structure these kinds of issues. American society is a racist society, or one where Black and Indigenous people and those of other racialized groups are structurally disempowered, or denied a full say over what our society does, how it is structured, who controls resources. Ours is a class society where the labor of the vast majority of the population is controlled and directed by a minority elite of capitalists who make decisions that harm the rest of us to their exclusive benefit. And most fundamentally, ours is an undemocratic society. We live in a world where all of us here are ruled and governed by states, by a minority class of rulers who make decisions for us and impose them by force. This is not a world where all of us together are actually capable of coming together and making collective decisions about how to relate to the rest of the web of life. And so the system that we live in gives the ruling class the power to pursue ecological destruction that enriches them and harms humanity as a whole. And these kinds of baseline inequalities become even more striking at the global scale, which is where the scale at which these kinds of problems, like climate change, are taking place. A given woman living in Bangladesh who lives on $2 a day has, I think, a fundamentally different relationship to the ecological crisis than a billionaire with a private jet. Said billionaire is busy building himself a fortress to weather the various calamities ahead and keep out all of us. And she, who has effectively contributed nothing to the climate crisis, is going to live in a world where 2/3 of her country is going to sink beneath the Bay of Bengal. I don't think it's just misguided. I think it is morally perverse to suggest that these two people have anything resembling the same relationship to the ecological crisis, or to why we are having an ecological crisis. And so, obviously, so many people in the ruling class have vested interest in various forms of extraction and destructive practices with respect to our biosphere and our local ecologies. But more to the point, the problem is the social system that keeps them in power at our expense. And so, on one level, we can say the ruling class is responsible for the ecological crisis. But I would say that instead, as we have an ecological crisis because we have a ruling class. And that's what we need to change. And so this humanity as a whole narrative, it masks the nature of the problem. But I think, more fundamentally, it denies the possibility of a social transformation, and thus poses no real threat to that ruling class or to their social position. And ultimately, if we are going to survive this coming century, whatever's coming down the pipe ecologically, we have to threaten that social position. All of the exploited and oppressed people of the world must tear that down. And this is something that the ISC and social ecologists have been discussing and thinking through for a very long time. In the early 1960s, Murray Bookchin wrote an essay which he referred to ecology as the revolutionary science, because taking ecological problems seriously and doing anything to resolve them necessarily places us on a collision course with the basic structures of capitalist society. And if we are to resolve the roots of this crisis, that necessitates a total transformation of the society we live in. And so we try to push people to approach the ecological crisis with a revolutionary politics. And so Bookchin was the first to flesh out what we might call this ecological critique of capitalism. Another thing that he wrote, I'm just going to read because it's short and sweet. He said, "Capitalism can no more be persuaded to limit growth than a human being can be persuaded to stop breathing. Attempts to green capitalism, to make it ecological, are doomed by the very nature of the system as a system of endless growth." This is in the context of writing about climate change in the 1960s. But even at that point, when the modern environmental movement was emerging and the ecological crisis seemed quite dire, folks then were really underestimating the pace of events. Bookchin thought that climate change would be a disaster for humanity in 200 years down the road, and it's been 60 or so years, and we're really finding ourselves on the brink. And I also want to say that the relationship of social systems of hierarchy are not just sources of ecological degradation. I think they're also incapable of responding to them effectively. And this is something that the global climate movement has been wrestling with for basically as long as global climate accords have been happening, where everyone involved in the process knows that we are on the brink of unprecedented disaster, which the lives of millions of people are at minimum or on the line, and yet none of these conferences, summits, etc., have ever resulted in adequate commitments by the world's governments, even those who were elected on platforms of doing so. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that these are the people who hold state power in their given societies. States are top-down, violent forms of social control. Their purposes are mainly for going to war with other states or maintaining domestic repression to ensure that the wheels of exploitation can continue to turn despite our resistance. The very power of these people to try to respond to these things rests on the system of social domination that is unraveling our biosphere. And so the kind of political response to the ecological crisis, I think, must necessarily come from below. We should not be waiting on or ever expecting people in power to respond to the crisis, because doing so would be to robbing themselves of their own social power. And in social ecology, we apply this ecological critique not just to capitalism. It applies to capitalism because capitalism is such a uniquely violent and an authoritarian form of social organization. But the underlying logic applies to all systems of hierarchy and domination, whether that's white supremacy or colonialism or patriarchy or the state. And so, in kind of the early days of social ecology in the 60s and 70s, there's a real conscious effort to try to think through these social problems as the interactions between a variety of systems of domination that shore one another up, that are each enmeshed in the ecological crisis in different ways. And so, kind of to deploy more recent terminology, I think social ecology can be thought of in that period as sort of an early form of what we today call intersectionality, trying to understand domination beyond class alone, but in terms of race, gender, sexuality, nationality, and our relationship to the state. And so this ecological critique of hierarchy, I think, needs to shape our strategic response to the ecological crisis, and push us to attempt to pursue a politics that does not depend on rulers placed above us, but seeks to create a politics without them, where we have a politics of non-domination, and the specific political form that we advocate for embodying that is direct democracy. But this push to develop a politics without rulers placed above us brings me to the third and final core idea of social ecology, which is that only through a social revolution, overturning the present system and birthing a new one that is consciously ecological, directly democratic, and socially egalitarian, can we bring human society back into harmony with the rest of nature. So this is the political vision of social ecology. Obviously, how we would go about achieving that is an immense question, and I don't think it's one that anyone really has a singular answer to. But it's the main one that we're going to be wrestling with over this coming week, that lots of our discussions to come are going to be focused on, and we'll be trying to think through some of the core insights of social ecology, of the Black radical tradition, and other movements, to think through our own responses today, because this kind of revolutionary politics has never been more urgent. So I'm going to leave it there, and we can just open things up, see if any others have thoughts or questions. I have a request for you all, though. Our main challenge with the previous session was that people on Zoom couldn't hear very well unless you were speaking to the mic. So I've set this one up here. If you have something to say, just walk on up and speak into the mic. Thanks all. Questions, thoughts, dissenting opinions?
So this is kind of a half-baked question or contention, but I'll bite on the freedom as the most contentious of the tendencies. And I'm curious, like, to me it feels like or I worry that it's just a more abstract version of human as the ultimate organism kind of hierarchy, where we're taking a thing that sort of, I think, humans are uniquely oriented towards in terms of making conscious, social, intelligent choices together, and saying that that's like a tendency in nature overall.
So this is one of the main criticisms of dialectical naturalism and some of the perspectives on kind of like Bookchin's and other social ecologists' views of nature, which is that they're doing the same thing that they accuse the reactionaries of doing, of kind of projecting their own social vision back onto the natural world. And your point is well taken. I think part of the challenge also is there's a lot going on in natural history and in terms of like the many directions that life develops in. And so there's also, the danger of zeroing in on the aspects of that developmental history that most interest us, or seem most important politically, and kind of zeroing in on those. One of the other tendencies that sometimes gets drawn out is complexity. There's a historical tendency towards ever and ever greater levels of complexity. This often gets criticized as kind of seeing only the part of natural history that like most resembles ourselves, because obviously single-celled organisms are evolving all the time. They have just as long of an evolutionary history as anything else, and there's lots of organisms that become simpler over time. So I've tried to steer away from that a little bit and kind of zero in on the ones that I think are more, or tendencies that are more scientifically rigorous. But freedom is definitely a little, it's more of an edge case, I think. I will say that when I'm trying to talk about these tendencies, I'm thinking of them in terms of not the particular trajectory of any group of living things over evolutionary time, but things that there's a tendency to develop out of the system, out of the web of life as a whole over time. And that's why I think freedom is more defensible as a framework, because I think the very complexity and dynamism of ecological interactions that are produced by these other processes of change over time necessitate organisms of any degree of bodily complexity to have variable responses to their world. So even if not everything is going to evolve a mind, I think the world that we have is going to evolve minds. Would be my argument to Nick there. But this is something that we all also debate internally a lot. Not everyone in social ecology land agrees with everywhere that I framed it, or that Bookstrom would frame it, or Haya's going to be talking tomorrow about some of this too, and we'll probably have some debates about that too.
I had a similar-ish question around the freedom piece of things, because when you were talking about it, my first question that kind of came to mind was, what's the role between, like, the interplay between this self-directivity and interdependence? And a lot of how you framed how humans work was from a social perspective, which I agree with. And also when I think of things like biases and cognitive distortions in the way the human brain can tend to work, maybe I'm just being really pessimistic, but I worry that the freedom would lead to us recreating systems that we live in right now. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I would just say that human freedom with respect to our social relations is just another way of phrasing the capacity of human beings to organize themselves in a whole ton of different ways. And this is somewhat different framing or use of the word freedom than like one's individual or collective freedom. But that, we know for a fact from just our knowledge of human societies across time that the number of different ways that we can organize our societies are endlessly diverse, far more so than they have been for the past 200 years, in which state societies have most thoroughly dominated the globe. And so when I talk about humanity's capacity for freedom, what I'm really making the case for is that there is nothing fixed about our social forms, and we can change them. And we know people have in the past, and obviously there's lots of things in the way of that for our present, but I think we can again in the future. And that's kind of source for social optimism about many of the different social forms that human beings have experimented with are authoritarian and hierarchical, patriarchal, or racist, but there's so many different ones that we could do, that we have the capacity, we have the potential to consciously develop a society that that is free of those sources of domination. At least I think so.
We have a couple of Zoom questions and also a request to point a camera at this mic. So there's one here now, just to be aware. The first one is kind of a funny question, but what would it be a social ecological take on the current, quote, Orca rebellion?
Well, one of the really interesting things about orcas and is they're a lot like us, and I've been slowly building the case for the last couple of years that second nature is not something that only characterizes human societies. And in fact, the same mechanisms of social transmission rather than biological transmission of traits is something we see in all kinds of complex social animals, of which orcas are one. And orcas in particular have a whole suite of different social forms. And the ones that people know best are those that live along the coast of the Pacific Northwest, because there's the most studied population of orcas in the world. And there's a problem for a long time where people would go there to learn about orcas, and then they would go out and be marine biologists in other oceans, and they're like, none of this makes any sense. These animals behave radically different. Even in off these coastlines in Pacific Northwest, there's 4 different culturally distinct populations of orcas. If your northern and southern residents who teach their kids to only eat salmon. They literally eat nothing but salmon. 85% of their diet is a single species of salmon. And they have a particular social structure that looks totally different from other populations of orcas elsewhere around the world. And so the thing about these orca attacks on yachts and other boats, that if you've not like heard this in the news or whatever, that's what this question is referring to, is it's something that a couple of them figured out and then have been teaching each other to do. I am skeptical of there being kind of like a particular political content to it per se. Orcas have picked up lots of cultural fads from each other. There was a while where this one population, like all the teenage orcas would kill a fish and then swim around with it just on their head. And so this is kind of like, I don't know if this is fashion or whatever, but they do funny stuff and teach each other to do funny stuff, and which is, you know, how human social fads work. And when we try to map out these changes through transmission networks, the only conceptual tools that we have that like match data are ones from human sociology of how these things transmit over time. And so I think the quote unquote Orca uprising is one that's like very much a product of this kind of second nature of these processes of social change. I'll be honest, I am nervous about it becoming widespread, because I think the outcome of that is just people killing orcas, which I very much don't want. But maybe it'll inspire some of us to sink some yachts, so who knows? Yeah.
Yes, I've been in different movies ever since 1969. I haven't really stopped. Just been going to different movies and trying things out and trying to learn some things that make more sense. And what I've realized in the most recent period is that we're facing, like you say, a tremendous ecological crisis. But it's not just ecological, it's sociological, economic, it's on all levels, and it's extremely destructive. And what we have to figure out is how to do our work on the left or the movements better and more effectively and more clearly, because there's a lot of confusion about what works best. I think it's clear to a lot of people that Marxist-Leninism didn't really work that well. It has some good aspects, of course, but it also shared some values of capitalism, like top-down governance and love of industrialism and love of materialism. But what has to happen is what Martin Luther King called for. He said, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. And that really struck me, because I've been studying values of indigenous people, and I saw a lot of positive things in them. But not all indigenous people are the same. Some of them, like the Incas and the Aztecs, were becoming imperialists. So we don't just take all the values of the indigenous people as good. But on the whole, indigenous people around the world lived in harmony pretty much with nature. And they did not create destructive things like weapons and industrialization and, you know, all the things that capitalism has created that is very destructive. So we have to undergo a radical revolution of values. But where does it start? And it's clear to me that it has to start in our thinking, because our thinking just decides how we act. And we have to go deeper than just our culture. We have to go to our values, which underlie culture, underlie everything that we do. But the problem we have, of course, in this current period is that people are very unclear about which values. Like, a lot of people really don't understand capitalist values, but they practice them unconsciously. For instance, individualism. I mean, we're saturated by individualism from the capitalist system, and it's hard to see what's wrong with that and the effects of individualism. But one of the things that a lot of people don't even realize is that individualism is what keeps us under the control of the tiny elite of less than 1% of the 330 million people in this country. We do their work for them in the sense that we take their capitalist values of individualism and we use them against each other. And as a result, they don't have to have the military in every place, crushing us, because we, with those individualistic values, we don't get together. We don't trust each other, we don't help each other, we don't cooperate. And that's exactly what keeps everything in place. So the change we want has to start in our values, in our minds. And that's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow morning. But I just wanted to, I wish that the people in the social ecology movement would go in more in that direction. And another aspect that I see is that movements are like organic beings. They have infancy, they have youth, they have maturity. And this movement is relatively new. It's like a toddler. But I've noticed a lot of movements that are just beginning, they want to take on big projects, like elections, as if somehow that's going to change things. We would have elections since the beginning of this country, and it hasn't really changed anything. Things have just gotten worse, because we don't live in a democracy, we live in a plutocracy, ruled by the rich. But anyway, this is an area that I've started to study, but I want other people to take those ideas, spread them around, study them, and talk to each other, not just as individuals, but talk to each other in our groups. Because we won't change individually by ourselves. We have to change in our groups, and we can help each other change. So that's what I would like this movement to talk more about. How do we accomplish these goals? Where do we start? Because we have to go in stages. We can't change the revolution overnight. In the 60s, we were foolish. We said to each other in San Francisco, we're going to have a revolution in 5 years. Instead, we got Nixon and Reagan. So it's going to take a while.
Thank you, Roberto. Peace. So I'll ask my question and then I'll explain a little bit to make it more clear. But my question, I think, is something about the part about ascribing, like, can we ascribe the same kind of intrinsic antagonism between capitalism and ecology to like statehood and states and ecology being like intrinsically an antagonism to each other? And I feel like the question or the clarification might be, what exactly are we defining as statehood? My explanation of the question, because it's not necessarily coming from defense of state structures or states in themselves, but just for analytical clarity, I think my own kind of anti-state orientation was problematized or complicated when I started to integrate my practice, my thought, my sense of revolution in a more internationalist frame, where there's the US and European nation states are very particular, kind of play a very particular imperial role or have historically. But I'm an Egyptian. Many of the decolonial revolutionary struggles were about national liberation and establishing statehood and independence from US imperialism. Likewise, today I think of examples of Cuba. If we think of Cuba, maybe that's not quite what you are describing as a state, but if we think of it as a Cuban state, can we say that because it is a state, it's intrinsically an antagonism to ecological existence? And then, of course, the struggle for liberation of Palestine, and that being a struggle not ubiquitously, but certainly there's a character of it about establishing a Palestinian state. So I ask it from the lens of like the actual analytical framework to understand that antagonism, but also as a question of, are we alienating ourselves from the character and
form that mass struggle was taking beyond Europe and the US by defining our kind of revolutionary politic first in this lens. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. I think a big part of the challenge analytically is the word state has highly contested meanings, and of course the last 170 years, the big debate about this in the revolutionary movement, at least in the Western world, has been between anarchists on one hand and Marxists on the other. And I think a big part of what's really unhelpful or unproductive about this debate is both are using quite radically different definitions of the state, of the phrase "the state," and results in a lot of talking past one another that isn't super useful. Actually, the one class that I teach the IC is on this question specifically of the role of the state in Marxist political theory and kind of the tendency in within Marxism for kind of like an anti-statist or radically democratic politics, the way that I'm using the word state is an institution of violence that entails a minority ruling elite to exercise repressive force against the population as a whole. It's not the Marxist definition of the state, but I think it's the more useful one for kind of like digging into what the problems are for state forms and how we relate to them. And it's absolutely true that many anti-colonial revolutions, at least the faction of them that succeeded, because these are politically heterogeneous movements, was towards the creation of independent states. I think we can both like have a revolutionary anti-colonial politics and also criticize these political approaches as insufficiently radical. And I think we can see this across the kind of the outcomes of a lot of national liberation movements over the 20th century. Many of these ultimately secured political independence from their colonizer. But because the political form that was left behind, which is a European import, the nation state is a product of 17th and 19th century European political history that they then exported around the world. I think that is a form of colonialism as well. Because these political forms basically propped up a particular ruling elite, mostly composed of the educated middle classes of the colonized. You then had a class that had kind of a vested interest in reweaving their country's economic relationships with their colonizers. And this was the process that was kind of critiqued over the 70s and 80s as neocolonialism, where these countries are no longer politically controlled by their colonizers, but they are still enmeshed in a relationship of economic extraction. And this got much worse in the context of the global South's debt crisis and neoliberalism from the late 70s onward. But it was something that many thinkers in these revolutionary national liberation movements identified the kernel of, even in the period of these wars for independence. This is kind of a focus in parts of, for example, Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, kind of identifying the national bourgeoisie as the source of future repression against colonized people. The other thing I think we should keep in mind, especially for our hemisphere, where I think most of what we have to learn from movements internationally is really in Latin America. I think that's where like the context is closest to the United States in terms of like the racial structure of their societies, their colonial histories, the degrees of social inequality. And you know, these are societies that have like been in a position of imperial domination by the United States. But their states there are also all colonial states. They're the political institutions created by the colonizers and have a very parallel history in many cases of genocide to their indigenous peoples, and even the left-wing like pink tide governments of the past 20 years that I think we have a lot to celebrate about are not outside of those dynamics. I think like a good case of this is Venezuela, which has done, you know, basically like try to pursue an independent economic model to kind of free the Venezuelan people from domination by the United States. But that economic project has also depended on extraction on indigenous lands. And you know, the bulk of state violence in Venezuela in terms of like people killed by police and National Guard forces are indigenous Venezuelans, Black Venezuelans in urban areas, and you know, the environmental histories of a lot of these kind of like developmental states in the post-colonial period are actually quite disastrous. You said you're from Egypt, who was kind of like part of this whole thing, the non-aligned movement, and you know, the struggle to kind of like create an independent post-colonial economic model that would free them from European domination. And a lot of those mega projects, you know, like the Aswan Dam or other efforts, were kind of inspired by the same vision of modernization as their colonizers, because their goal was to kind of catch up to the European world. And this is what Roberto was talking about, of kind of like we still retain some of these colonial capitalist values in terms of like what our goals were, and so the ecological consequences of those projects were disastrous. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that the relationship that we have to movements internationally, you know, it's not one where we in the United States should be like taking the lead in the tone, the focus, the orientation of the international movement. But we also have to keep in mind that these movements in countries around the world are not politically homogenous. You know, the things that we kind of like hear in terms of their political content are the dominant factions of their, you know, progressive movements or whatever. It's no different from this country, where if you kind of assess from outside what is the left-wing movement in the United States, well, it's like Bernie Sanders and AOC. But we are, you know, we are dissidents on that front as well. And the same is true in Venezuela, in Cuba, in Syria, etc. And you know, it's a messy, complicated world that we gotta navigate and orient ourselves to. And I think I will also just say that a lot of the hang-ups and the kind of like political conceptions of Marxism and statist forms of radical politics kind of get stuck on the belief that a minority ruling elite can hand off power to the people at large. And I think we've seen again and again that's unrealistic, that is utopian in the pejorative sense. And I think if we are serious about wanting the dissolution of these systems of domination. We need to have popular base that is seeking to nest political power at the base in horizontal forms where we can fight back, we can marshal significant levels of force against capitalists, against imperialists. But a politics that attempts to distill all of that into a single party organization or so forth is reproducing the dynamics of the society we're trying to overthrow.
We have one from Lauren Sargent asking, what does radical municipalism and direct democracy look like here in Michigan in 2023, in Detroit and our other cities?
Well, it doesn't exist yet, so I would say it doesn't look like a whole lot. This is something I'm going to be talking more about on Tuesday. But I think for the Detroit context, and I will say I know much less about other cities in Michigan more broadly. I think this means kind of needing to do some, and this cross applies across contexts, need to do real investigation of our own social landscapes, the kinds of institutions of community organization and self-governance that already exist in our neighborhoods. And Detroit has one of the most expansive landscapes of such community institutions anywhere in the country. And, so most of my focus or kind of optimism as a social base is in a Detroit-specific institution called block clubs, which are these hyper-local neighborhood organizations that basically anybody who lives in a given place can join and participate in. And this is something that Eleanor and I are going to talk more about in a couple days. But the institutional focus or the institutional goal of the politics of social ecology is developing people's assemblies, spaces of democratic deliberation that are face-to-face, where we can retain decision-making power to ourselves, not hand it off to politicians or whoever else. And lots of communities around the country have existing organizational forms that are people's assemblies in embryo, or that could be reorganized as such. And so I think the process there looks like figuring out which organizations exist that have that kind of potential based on how they're set up, or figure out if you need to start something new instead, getting neighbors together, democratizing those so that they're genuinely participatory. There's something that anyone can engage in and have their voice affect what actually happens in their community, and then stitching these together across the whole city into a counterpower to the municipal government. And this is an approach to politics that we call dual power. It's something that is characterized just about every successful social revolution in human history in one form or another. And I think we'll be making the case for why that should frame our strategic thinking about organizing and in our own work in our communities.
Yeah, I have a question about kind of balancing the critique of hierarchy and the urgency of kind of the climate crisis. And as Roberta said, even as we critique these systems, we can embody hierarchical relations, and the process of creating a social relations that are free from these things is a decades, potentially, long process of work, of social work, of coming together and it's not, beyond from an intellectual standpoint, but from a relational standpoint and being in, communities, this is, we need a lot of training in this. And how do you, or social ecologists, kind of balance this kind of broad critique of hierarchy and the urgency for climate action and short-term, moderate, and long-term aims and focuses?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it's kind of like the fucking dilemma that we have, where the kind of movement building that's required to get us free is, a multi-generational project. And we don't actually have multiple generations to right this ship. And so the argument that I generally make for this is there's lots of things that states could be doing to, if not resolve the fundamentals of the ecological crisis, which I think they're structurally incapable of doing, at least buying us some time. And so, my thinking with respect to social democrats who run for office on climate platforms or whatnot is those of us who have a revolutionary politics. I don't think we should prioritize that work. Progressives and social democrats are going to do it anyway. I hope they win. I hope they succeed, because we need to, at minimum, be slowing emissions to give ourselves time to build a kind of revolutionary movement to transform things more fundamentally. And I think we should have an outlook along those lines that doesn't put any ultimate political faith in these kinds of electoral projects, because these are the very people in power that we will find ourselves confronting down the road if they do succeed. And that's the story of all sorts of revolutionary movements across history, where the first wave of the successful moderate revolutionaries are pitted against the people in the streets after they come to power. And I think we should be clear-headed about that and doing everything we can to build popular movements that are outside the state to push on them, apply external pressure, and have the social force to depose them when we're able to. But we could really use some reforms at this time too, to buy ourselves some time. The other thing that I think we need to start thinking about is, and I don't say lots of people aren't thinking about this. I think this is kind of the frame of reference that lots of younger organizers are approaching these questions with, is a lot of our work is not going to be halting the ecological crisis per se, but building community preparedness so that we're going to survive the catastrophes that happen. It does, no matter what happens politically, we could have best case scenario electorally all over the world in the next couple of years. There's a lot of baked in climate disruption that has already started and is going to continue to worsen, even if we shut all this down immediately. And so I think we need to have kind of a strategic orientation to these inevitable crises. On one hand, being able to be prepared socially, organizationally, to kind of absorb the popular energy that will come with that when there are major shocks to the system, and ensure that we have some basic democratically controlled community infrastructure of survival. And that's where mutual aid work, food sovereignty, other kinds of cooperative institutions, I think, are really crucial, because a lot of the capitalist world is stretched in terms of supply chain structure and our food system, and these things are highly vulnerable to these kinds of shocks. And, that both presents a serious threat that lots of people will get hurt or killed as a result of major climate events. But it also creates space for us to kind of insert these new alternatives, to draw more people into things that are stable and participatory and collective, because that's what we're going to need to survive those kinds of those kinds of events. And lots of I would say most revolutionary mass movements that have taken place in history have not been something that was planned out by revolutionary organizations, where they got everybody to join their party, and then they decided this is the day where we overthrow all this. There are systemic shocks that cast everything into question. And the only thing that we can be really sure of for the next 10, 20 years is that there's going to be a lot of those. They're going to be happening more and more frequently. And so we should be kind of approaching, in my view, our organizing work towards having some of the baseline social infrastructure and organization in place to be able to respond to them. If there's events that suddenly bring everybody out into the street and we have to cobble together our processes for democratic decision making in our neighborhood on the fly, we're gonna have a much harder time than if there's something that's already grounded in the community, that has been like an enduring institution, knows how to run its stuff, get people fed, and act collectively. Even that's starting with only a minority of people involved. Those can absorb that kind of radical energy. And this is one of the things that Bookchin was writing about for a long time, about kind of like sources for hope, which is that the kinds of society-wide disruptions that are caused by the ecological crisis is the very source of widespread radicalization that we're going to need. Because these revolutionary movements happen when millions of people act. We're not gonna have millions of people in our community organizations at the start, but the kinds of things coming down the pipeline are, I think, going to push those kinds of numbers into action in some way. I think we saw glimmers of that in 2020, and I think it's only going to get bigger from here on out. I think he's next up.
I'll be quick. Just a question of sort of how you see the ecological philosophy of social ecology relating to the political content. And I think for me, what I find it easier to see is this idea that humans are part of nature, not separate, and kind of the first nature, second nature. That to me makes sense feeding into the politics. But as people were asking about earlier, kind of like, is there a tendency in an evolution for greater freedom or for greater diversification and complexity? I think those are really interesting questions, but I wonder if you have more to say about sort of what that matters for the kind of political content of social ecology.
So Bookchin thought that you could sort of use this understanding of natural history's underlying tendencies to develop an ethics and kind of an assessment that what is good, what is normatively valuable, is that which contributes to life's diversification and complexity and interdependence and freedom. And this is like one of the major theoretical debates in social ecology of it gets critiqued on one hand as like a naturalistic fallacy of deriving ought from is and everything else. And I'm on the skeptic side of that debate. I honestly don't talk about ethics a whole lot in social ecology, even though for some of the like older generation of theorists it was really central. in my view, you know, the people that kind of like embrace life should flourish and we should treat each other equally and be mutualistic in our relations are already going to be with us, and the people who aren't, I'm not sure you can persuade them by saying like, well, look at how evolution happened. So I'm not sure it's super politically useful. I do think that where I think it contributes in important ways to kind of like the political content is when, I say when, optimistically, when it comes time to actually making social decisions about how we interact with the rest of the web of life. I think understanding these things about our place in nature is an important part of being able to make conscious ecological decisions and situating ourselves in that natural world in a way that is grounded in reality, that kind of understands our reality dialectically, and but I'm less sure that it has like immediate importance for movement building. I kind of think of that stuff as more for framing the ecological democracy after on the way to the revolution.
My question was actually influenced by your last comment, so hopefully this speaks to something. First off, I just want to say thank you for everything you've given us, Mason. It's really cool to see somebody speak off the dome, because I don't have that skill myself, so just shout out to you and your brain. My question to you, so you began this talk framing with a couple framings. Humans are a part of nature, ecological crisis is a social crisis, and like only a social revolution can bring us into harmony. So my question to you is, like, I'm curious your thoughts on the role of spirituality and theology in this revolution of values that you were talking about. Because thinking about indigenous worldviews, spiritualities that center creation and the earth as like the most sacred thing, in comparison with European and Western spirituality that puts humans above nature, feels like the foundations of our current values. And I'm just curious how you're thinking about those spiritual and theological narratives in the process of making that social evolution.
Well, so I would say that the kind of like cosmology of ecological societies is essential. And I think that's kind of like one of the things that Western ecological science has sort of struggled along the road to catching up with. Because the history of ecology as a discipline sort of starts from trying to understand these processes in mechanistic terms, as if we're talking about physics and laws of motion, and kind of along that way of butting up against actual ecological reality, realizing that that frame of reference does not let you understand the complexity of these ecosystems that are place in them. And I think part of the challenge for communicating this stuff is that the webs of interdependence are so complex that we almost can't make sense of them except through transcendent metaphors of our relationship to those. And I think various like indigenous spiritualities that frame these things in terms of the sacred they're sets of conceptual devices for actually doing that, of communicating our place in the world in far more true terms than we're really able to convey by nutrient flows and everything else. I also think that the role of kind of like an ecological spiritual reawakening is a source of social imagination as well. We kind of have to rethink our place in the world in these most fundamental terms, and I think people need some sort of deeper level nudges for that to happen. I should also say that this has been a long-running debate and discussion in the radical environmental movement for a long time, and many of the movement spaces of ecology in the 80s and 90s leaned really heavily into sort of environmental spirituality. And I think we, at the same time, everything I just said notwithstanding, I think also need to have a sort of critical or careful approach to that sort of things, because I'm not going to get to any details, but there's lots of ways in which the sort of anti-rationalist, kind of like anarchist spirituality stuff that was going on also tended into misanthropic stuff, into racist and sexist ways of thinking about our relationship to nature that was, essentializing in terms of gender and everything else. And so I think part of the risk of a spirituality politics is that you're kind of grounding values in spaces that are outside of deliberation and discussion and critique. Because you can't really have a rational critique of spirituality exists outside of that. And that makes it harder to challenge some of the other, hierarchical or essentializing ways of thinking that can crop up. So I don't have a definitive answer on how to respond to that, but I think those are the kind of like tensions that this debate is strung between.
I just want to say something I learned from Grace Lee Boggs a few years back. After the rebellion in Detroit, the big rebellion, she realized that there's a difference between rebellion and revolution. Rebellion is sort of like, it can take place overnight, but a revolution can take years. And what we're trying to do is a revolution. So we have to be careful, because a lot of people thought that what happened in Tahrir Square in Egypt was a revolution, but it wasn't. It was just a rebellion. And it was organized primarily by a capitalist institution, Facebook. And it didn't, the military took it over easily, because they had not built the dual power relationships that they needed, the institutions, they had not created alternate institutions that could carry them through that period, and that's going to take a long time.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, I think mine's kind of bouncing off the two of the things, right? Because I appreciate what you said about building power outside of the states and dual power, and being able to so like in momentum building, there's those times where a crisis happens or something, and having the infrastructure in place so that in those moments we can provide leadership in a space to kind of like move forward in a way, and kind of you kind of touched on my question though, because it's like sometimes I guess like instead of like focusing in on like dismantling the state through like direct, like how to build that compelling, you know what I mean? Because like sometimes I see like a lot of these spaces, like we're not building on the ground, build alternatives to the extent that like it makes the old obsolete, you know what I mean? So like if we're going to challenge the status quo and move into like to a deeper space of community, like a beloved community, right? Like how are we focusing in on like what we can be together to like heighten the contradiction and make that like the possibility known. You know, because so I don't know if you can speak on that. Or
I think you put it better than I could. That's I mean, that's kind of like the heart of building a new world and the shell of the old, where I think a lot of people's social imaginations are restricted by experience. None of us have lived democratic lives. We go about our day rather making decisions for ourselves individually, or somebody else in charge of stuff is making them for us. And we don't have lived experience that something else works. We got to go prove that something else works.